6 months after the incident, a local newspaper did a follow-up story. They found Margaret in her garden planting spring flowers. When asked about her newfound fame, she just smiled and said, "Sometimes life gives you a chance to show others what you've always known, that every person deserves respect and that standing up for that principle is always worth it." The reporter noticed that Margaret's garden had more visitors these days. Neighbors would stop by to chat, often bringing their children or grandchildren to meet the lady who had taught everyone that courage doesn't have an age limit and that standing up to bullies never goes out of style. As the one-year anniversary of the incident approached, Central Park Market planned a community day celebrating diversity and respect. Margaret agreed to cut the ribbon, though she insisted it wasn't about her, it was about the principle she had stood for all her life. The story of that Sunday morning continues to be shared, not just as a tale of standing up to racism, but as a reminder that strength comes in many forms and that dignity and courage can appear in the most unexpected moments, even during a routine shopping trip at the local grocery store. In the days that followed the incident at Central Park Market, the story took on a life of its own. Local news coverage turned into national headlines, and social media buzzed with discussions about standing up to racism and the unexpected strength of a retired schoolteacher. But for Margaret Johnson, life continued with its usual quiet dignity. The legal consequences unfolded swiftly. The district attorney's office, presented with overwhelming evidence including security footage, multiple witness statements, and cell phone videos, moved quickly to charge Karen Davidson. She faced charges of assault and battery with hate crime enhancements, a development that shocked her social circle and employer. Davidson's carefully constructed image crumbled rapidly. Her country club membership was revoked. The real estate firm where she worked as a senior agent placed her on immediate leave. Her social media accounts, once filled with perfectly posed photos at charity galas, went silent as she retreated from public view. Meanwhile, Margaret's story resonated with people across the country. News outlets praised her composure and courage. Letters and cards arrived at the store daily, addressed simply to Mrs. Johnson, the brave lady at Central Park Market. Children sent drawings of her standing up to the bully, many depicting her with a superhero cape. The store itself became an unexpected symbol of community solidarity. Regular customers brought flowers for Margaret's usual shopping time on Sunday mornings. The produce manager created a small display near her favorite section, featuring a framed photo of Margaret with store employees from a Christmas party years ago. Local schools reached out to Margaret, asking her to speak to students about standing up to bullies and maintaining dignity in the face of hatred. She accepted these invitations with characteristic humility, sharing her story not as a tale of violence, but as a lesson about self-respect and courage. "You see," she would tell the students, adjusting her reading glasses, "strength isn't about size or age. It's about knowing who you are and standing up for what's right. Sometimes that means walking away, and sometimes that means standing your ground." The court proceedings moved forward methodically. Davidson's expensive lawyer tried to paint the incident as a simple misunderstanding, but the evidence told a different story. The security footage, played in the courtroom, showed every moment of her harassment and assault with crystal clarity. Community support for Margaret continued to grow. A local civil rights organization honored her at their annual dinner. The school board, where she had taught for over 3 decades, passed a resolution commending her lifetime of service and courage. Even the mayor mentioned her in a speech about community values and standing up against hatred. Davidson's guilty plea came as no surprise to those who had witnessed the incident. The judge's sentence included mandatory anger management classes, community service, and a significant fine. More importantly, she was required to attend diversity and sensitivity training, a requirement that made headlines across the state. But perhaps the most significant impact was felt in quiet, personal ways. Elderly shoppers at Central Park Market reported feeling more confident, knowing that age didn't mean vulnerability. Young people spoke about learning to stand up to bullies while maintaining dignity. Parents used Margaret's story to teach their children about courage and respect. Margaret herself returned to her normal routine with characteristic grace. She still arrived at the store every Sunday morning at 8, carefully selecting her produce and greeting employees by name. The only difference was the occasional shopper who would stop to shake her hand or thank her for being an inspiration. The store manager installed a small plaque near the entrance. "All are welcome here. Shop with respect." It was a simple message, but its meaning resonated with everyone who knew the story behind it. Davidson's photo was quietly added to the security officer's wall of banned customers. In her neighborhood, Margaret continued her usual activities, tending her garden, volunteering at the library's reading program, and hosting Sunday dinners for her family. Her grandchildren proudly told their friends about their strong grandma, though Margaret would just smile and change the subject. The police officers had finished gathering statements and were reviewing their notes. The evidence was overwhelming. Multiple witness accounts, security footage, cell phone videos, all telling the same story. Davidson's unprovoked assault and Margaret's measured response were documented from every angle. In the store's break room, employees on their lunch break watched the local news coverage on a small television. The story had already been picked up by several stations, with headlines like "Elderly Woman Stands Up to Racist Aggressor" and "Sunday Shopping Trip Turns into Lesson About Dignity." Margaret's church friends had arrived, bringing her favorite tea in a thermos and offering support. They sat with her as she finished her police statement, their presence a reminder of the community that stood behind her. One of them had already arranged for volunteers to help with her shopping for the next few weeks, though Margaret insisted she wouldn't let this incident change her routine. As the afternoon approached, the store's regular Sunday rhythm slowly began to return. Customers continued their shopping, though now they paused by the manager's office, some leaving notes of support for Margaret. A young girl shyly dropped off a hand-drawn card, her mother explaining that Mrs. Johnson had been her first-grade teacher years ago. The investigating officers finally closed their notebooks. The evidence was clear, and decisions about charges would need to be made. Davidson's earlier threats of lawsuits had been replaced by quiet tears as she realized the full consequences of her actions were about to unfold. Margaret stood up carefully, declining her daughter's offer of support. "I think," she said, straightening her shoulders, "it's time to finish my shopping. My grandchildren are coming for Sunday dinner, and I still need to pick up ingredients for their favorite dessert." The store manager immediately protested, offering to have someone gather her items for her, but Margaret shook her head. "That's very kind," she said with a gentle smile, "but I've never let bullies change how I live my life. I don't intend to start now." The afternoon sun streamed through the store's windows, casting long shadows across the aisles where, just hours before, an ordinary shopping trip had turned into something much more significant. As Margaret picked up her shopping basket again, determined to complete her weekly routine, she had no way of knowing that her story was about to spark important conversations throughout the community and beyond. In the hours following the incident at Central Park Market, the aftermath unfolded with unexpected speed. Local news vans began arriving in the parking lot, their satellite dishes stretching up against the late-morning sky. The store's regular Sunday crowd had transformed into a buzzing community of witnesses, each eager to share their version of what they'd seen. Margaret sat in the store manager's office, a fresh ice pack pressed gently against her cheek as she gave her official statement to the police. Her daughter sat beside her, occasionally squeezing her mother's hand in support. The office, usually filled with paperwork and scheduling charts, had become a temporary command center for handling the situation. "Mrs. Johnson," the investigating officer said, reviewing his notes, "can you walk us through one more time exactly what happened?" His tone was respectful, already having watched the security footage that clearly showed Davidson as the aggressor. Margaret's voice remained steady as she recounted the events. "I was doing my shopping just like every Sunday for the past 23 years. That woman began following me, making inappropriate comments. When I asked her to stop, she became physical." She paused, adjusting her glasses, which thankfully hadn't been broken in the incident. "I defended myself as anyone would." Outside in the store, employees were busy restoring order to the aisles where the confrontation had taken place. A young stock boy carefully reassembled a display of cereal boxes that had been knocked over during the incident. The floor where Davidson's purse had spilled was now clean, though customers still pointed to the spot as they walked by, discussing what they'd witnessed. Davidson had been moved to a separate office, where she sat with a different set of officers. Her previous bravado had completely evaporated. Security footage played on a laptop in front of her, showing her actions in stark, undeniable detail. Her designer tennis outfit, which had seemed so pristine earlier, now looked rumpled and out of place. The store manager was busy handling calls from corporate headquarters. The incident had already made its way up the chain of command, and executives were scrambling to respond appropriately. In the background, his computer screen showed email after email arriving from concerned community members. Local news reporters interviewed witnesses in the parking lot, their cameras capturing the steady stream of customers eager to speak up for Margaret. The young mother who had recorded everything on her phone was showing the footage to a reporter, her children still wide-eyed from the morning's events. "She's not just any customer," the produce manager explained to one reporter, gesturing toward the store. "Mrs. Johnson has been shopping here for decades. She knows every employee by name, asks about their families. Last Christmas, she brought homemade cookies for the entire staff." Inside the manager's office, Margaret's daughter was scrolling through her phone, her expression growing increasingly concerned. "Mom, you're trending on social media," she said softly. Someone posted their video of what happened. Margaret adjusted her cardigan, smoothing out a wrinkle with practiced care. "Well," she said with a slight smile, "I suppose there are worse things to be known for than standing up to a bully." Davidson's demeanor continued to crumble as she realized the gravity of her situation. Her previous threats of lawsuits grew quieter and less convinced. When shown the security footage of her striking first, she fell silent altogether. The store's regular customers, many of whom had known Margaret for years, shared stories with the officers about her character, her volunteer work at the library, her years of teaching, her quiet dignity and kindness. Meanwhile, several other customers mentioned previous encounters with Davidson, describing her history of aggressive and racist behavior. As paramedics arrived to check both women for injuries, Margaret's daughter pulled into the parking lot, having been called by one of the church members who had witnessed the incident. She rushed to her mother's side, her face a mixture of concern and barely contained anger when she learned what had happened. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked, kneeling beside Margaret's chair. Her mother patted her hand reassuringly, in the same way she had comforted countless students over the years. "I'm fine, dear," Margaret said softly. "Some people just need to learn that age doesn't determine strength, and appearance doesn't define character." The Sunday morning sun now streamed fully through the store's windows, illuminating the scene in bright, clear light. What had started as a routine shopping trip had transformed into a powerful reminder that dignity and strength come in all ages, and that standing up to bullies sometimes means standing up for something much bigger than yourself. As the officers continued their investigation, the store manager announced over the intercom that he would be closing several aisles for cleanup. But many customers lingered, feeling that they had witnessed something important, a moment when justice, dignity, and courage had prevailed over hatred and prejudice. Margaret's ice pack had begun to melt, but she held it steadily, her posture straight and dignified. She had spent a lifetime teaching children about respect, courage, and standing up for what's right. Today, she had taught that lesson one more time, though in a way she never could have expected. The aftermath of the incident at Central Park Market unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. As Davidson stumbled backward, clutching her jaw, the entire store seemed to take a collective breath. The security cameras continued their silent recording, capturing every detail of what happened next. Davidson's composure shattered completely. Gone was the aggressive bully who had terrorized the store just moments before. In her place stood a woman who looked utterly lost, her carefully maintained image crumbling around her. Her designer tennis outfit, which had seemed so pristine earlier, was now rumpled and askew. "I'll sue you," Davidson shrieked, but her voice wavered with uncertainty. "I'll sue this whole store." Her threats echoed through the aisles, sounding hollow and desperate. The same customers who had witnessed her unprovoked attack now watched as she scrambled to gather her scattered belongings from the floor. Margaret remained standing tall, though her cheek still showed a red mark from Davidson's slap. Several customers had gathered around her protectively, including the elderly couple from her church and a young mother who had witnessed everything while shopping with her children. "Does anyone have ice?" The store manager called out, and immediately 3 employees rushed toward the freezer section. They returned with cold packs, which Margaret accepted with a gracious "thank you." Even in this chaotic moment, her years of teaching experience showed through. She remained composed, dignified, and polite. The first police officer arrived within minutes, followed quickly by 2 more patrol cars. As they entered the store, they found a scene that told its own story. Dozens of witnesses eager to speak, security cameras positioned perfectly to have captured everything, and multiple cell phone recordings of the incident. "She attacked me." Davidson tried to speak first, pointing an accusing finger at Margaret. But her voice cracked as several customers immediately stepped forward, phones in hand, ready to show the truth of what had happened. The produce manager, who had known Margaret for years, approached the officers. "We have everything on our security cameras," he said firmly. "This woman," he pointed to Davidson, "has been harassing Mrs. Johnson all morning. She made racist comments, followed her through the store, and then physically attacked her." The young mother who had recorded everything stepped forward, her phone already queued up to the incident. "I got it all on video," she said. "The racial slurs, the threats, everything." Her children peeked out from behind her, wide-eyed at the unfolding drama. Margaret sat quietly on a chair that someone had brought from the break room, holding the ice pack to her cheek. When the officers approached her, she spoke with the same clear, measured tone she had used in her classroom for over 3 decades. "I didn't want any trouble," she explained calmly. "I was just doing my weekly shopping, as I have for the past 23 years. When she struck me, I defended myself. I may be 68, but I'm not helpless." The officers listened carefully, taking notes and gathering statements from witnesses. One by one, customers and employees came forward to tell their parts of the story. The security footage was reviewed on the store's monitor, showing the entire sequence of events in crystal clear detail. The store erupted in a mixture of gasps, exclamations, and, from more than a few observers, poorly suppressed cheers. Davidson's designer purse went flying, spilling its contents across the floor. Her phone skidded under a display of cereal boxes. Davidson's hand flew to her jaw, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. The woman who had been so bold, so aggressive just moments before, now looked utterly stunned. Her carefully maintained image of superiority had been shattered as completely as Margaret's fallen reading glasses. You hit me," Davidson spluttered, her voice a mixture of outrage and incredulity. "You can't do that." The absurdity of her statement, coming just moments after she had struck first, was not lost on the gathered crowd. Margaret calmly straightened her cardigan and spoke in the same measured tone she used with troublesome students for over 3 decades. "My father taught me never to start a fight. But he also taught me to finish one if someone else starts it." The store manager had finally gotten through to the police. Security footage was already being reviewed and saved. Customers who had recorded the incident on their phones were approaching store employees, offering to share their videos as evidence. Davidson, still holding her jaw, looked around wildly, suddenly seeming to realize that every witness in the store had seen her throw the first punch. Her face, already red from exertion, turned an even deeper shade as the implications of her actions began to sink in. The morning sunlight streaming through the store windows had shifted, casting long shadows down the aisles. What had started as a peaceful Sunday morning shopping trip had transformed into a moment that would be remembered and retold throughout the community for years to come. Margaret finally bent down to retrieve her fallen glasses, checking them carefully for damage. A young employee rushed forward with a tissue for her reddened cheek. The elderly couple from her church hurried over to make sure she was all right. And throughout it all, Margaret maintained the same dignity and composure that had carried her through decades of life's challenges. The scene was about to shift again as the distant sound of police sirens began to grow louder. But for now, in this frozen moment, the Central Park Market had become the stage for an unexpected lesson about respect, consequences, and the mistake of judging someone by their age or appearance. What happened next at Central Park Market unfolded so quickly that witnesses would later struggle to describe the exact sequence of events. Davidson, still clutching her phone in one hand, suddenly lashed out with her other hand, striking Margaret across the face with such force that the elderly woman's reading glasses clattered to the floor. The sound of the impact seemed to echo through the store. Time itself appeared to freeze for a moment as everyone processed what had just happened. The store manager's mouth dropped open in shock. A young cashier let out an audible gasp. The The security cameras captured everything in stark, unforgiving detail. Margaret staggered back slightly, more from surprise than pain. Her cheek stung where Davidson's hand had connected, but something else was burning inside her. A lifetime of dignity, strength, and self-respect that refused to be diminished by this act of hatred. Now you'll learn to respect your betters. Davidson crowed triumphantly, her voice shrill with a bizarre mixture of satisfaction and continued rage. She clearly expected Margaret to cower, to break down, to run away. Her designer tennis bracelet glinted under the fluorescent lights as she raised her hand again. But Margaret Johnson hadn't spent 68 years on this earth to become a victim now. She hadn't marched for civil rights in her youth, raised 3 children alone after her husband's death, or taught hundreds of students over her career just to let someone assault her in her local grocery store. Witnesses would later describe how Margaret's stance shifted ever so slightly. Those who knew her would recognize the same posture she used when facing down unruly students or confronting bullies in her school hallways. Her eyes, usually warm and kind, took on a steely glint. The store manager was already reaching for his phone to call the police. 2 other customers were moving forward to intervene. But before anyone could reach them, Davidson made the mistake of trying to strike Margaret again. This time, Margaret was ready. With a speed that belied her age, she caught Davidson's wrist mid-swing. Years of gardening and carrying stacks of textbooks had kept her stronger than her attacker had expected. Davidson's expression of smug superiority quickly transformed into one of confusion and fear. "Young lady," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of decades in the classroom, "I believe that's quite enough." And with a movement that seemed almost casual, Margaret delivered a single precise punch that caught Davidson squarely on the jaw. It wasn't a wild swing or an aggressive attack. It was the controlled response of someone who had learned long ago that sometimes standing up for yourself meant more than just words. The impact wasn't dramatic or exaggerated, but it was enough to send Davidson stumbling backward into her abandoned shopping cart. Margaret tried to maneuver her cart around Davidson, maintaining her composure even as her heart raced. She'd faced down angry parents, defiant students, and countless challenges in her life, but something about this woman's unhinged behavior set off warning bells. "Get out of my way," Davidson snarled, her designer purse swinging wildly as she gestured. "Get out of my store." The absurdity of claiming ownership of a chain grocery store might have been amusing in any other situation, but there was nothing funny about the hatred blazing in her eyes. Several phones were now recording the incident, their owners instinctively knowing this confrontation needed to be documented. The Sunday morning peace had been completely shattered, replaced by a thick tension that seemed to fill every corner of the store. Margaret stood her ground, years of experience teaching her that backing down to bullies only encouraged them. "This is a public store," she stated firmly, her teacher's voice carrying clear authority. "We all have the right to shop here." Davidson's response was cut off by the store manager's arrival. "Is there a problem here?" Mr. Thompson asked, positioning himself between the 2 women. But before he could take control of the situation, Davidson's rage reached its peak. Several customers gasped as Davidson reached into her designer purse. The security cameras captured every movement as she pulled out her phone, apparently intending to call someone. "I'm calling the police," she announced dramatically. "They'll deal with you people." The store had grown eerily quiet, the usual Sunday morning bustle replaced by tense silence. Even the cheerful store music seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The morning sunlight continued to stream through the windows, illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage. No one could have predicted what would happen next. The situation had escalated beyond a simple shopping dispute into something uglier, more primal. The security cameras continued recording, about to capture a moment that would shock everyone present and lead to serious consequences for all involved. The store manager tried one last time to defuse the situation. "Ladies, please," he began, but his words were drowned out by Davidson's continued tirade. The confrontation had reached a point of no return, and in the next few moments, everything would change dramatically. The air in the store grew thick with tension as Davidson's hands began to shake with rage. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. The peaceful Sunday morning shopping trip had transformed into a powder keg, and the fuse was burning short. The tension at Central Park Market reached its boiling point as Davidson abandoned all pretense of shopping. She planted herself directly in Margaret's path near the cereal aisle, her shopping cart positioned like a barrier. The morning light filtering through the store windows cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting the anger in her expression. "You people are always so slow," Davidson spat out, her voice rising above the gentle store music. "Why don't you go back where you came from?" The words echoed through the aisle, causing nearby shoppers to freeze in shock. A young employee dropping off fresh bread nearly dropped his basket, his eyes widening at the explicit racism. Margaret's hands tightened on her shopping cart handle, her knuckles turning white. She'd heard these words before, in the 1960s when she was a young teacher, in the 1980s when she became a principal, and now here in 2024 in her local grocery store. The weight of decades of similar confrontations pressed heavily on her shoulders. "Ma'am," Margaret said calmly, her voice steady despite the situation, "I've been shopping here for over 20 years. I'd appreciate it if you'd let me finish my shopping in peace." Her response, dignified and composed, seemed to infuriate Davidson even more. The store manager, Mr. Thompson, was quickly making his way toward them, having been alerted by several concerned customers. 2 aisles over, the produce manager was also approaching, abandoning his display of oranges. But they weren't moving fast enough to prevent what happened next. Davidson's tirade escalated, her voice growing shriller with each word. 20 years. Well, that's 20 years too long. This used to be a nice neighborhood before. She let the implication hang in the air, her face contorted with prejudice and rage. Other customers had stopped pretending to shop and were now openly watching. An elderly couple who regularly attended the same church as Margaret stood nearby, the husband already reaching for his phone. A young mother pulled her children behind her, shielding them from the scene while silently recording everything on her phone. The store's security cameras continued their silent vigil, capturing every moment as Davidson stepped closer to Margaret, invading her personal space. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed quietly, adding an eerie undertone to the confrontation. "I don't have to explain myself to you," Margaret responded, her voice still calm but firm. She taught generations of children about dignity and respect, and she wasn't about to abandon those principles now. "Please step aside so I can finish my shopping." Davidson's face turned an alarming shade of red. "You don't tell me what to do," she shrieked, her designer tennis bracelet jangling as she gesticulated wildly. "I know your type. You think you own the place now, don't you?" The store manager was now just 1 aisle away, moving as quickly as he could through the Sunday morning crowd. An off-duty security guard who regularly shopped at the store was also approaching, recognizing the dangerous situation unfolding. As the morning wore on, the store grew busier, with more Sunday shoppers filling the aisles. The increased audience seemed to fuel Davidson's performance. She began making phone calls on her speakerphone, loudly complaining about the type of people shopping at the store, making sure her voice carried to everyone nearby. The tension in the air was palpable. Regular customers who knew Margaret from her years of shopping, they began to position themselves strategically around the store, creating an informal network of watchful eyes. The store's usual Sunday morning peace had been replaced by an atmosphere of anticipation, as if everyone could sense that something was about to happen. Little did anyone know that this was just the beginning. Davidson's behavior was about to cross a line that would transform a simple Sunday morning shopping trip into an incident that would be talked about in the community for months to come. The security cameras continued recording, their footage soon to become crucial evidence in what would unfold next. The morning light streaming through the store's windows had grown stronger, casting harsh shadows that seemed to mirror the growing tension in the aisles. What had started as subtle antagonism was about to escalate into something that would test Margaret's strength and resolve in ways she hadn't experienced in years. The peaceful Sunday morning atmosphere at Central Park Market was about to shift dramatically. Karen Davidson, a woman in her mid-40s wearing designer yoga pants and a pristine white tennis jacket, had been following Margaret's movements with growing irritation. Her shopping cart contained only a few items: organic quinoa, imported mineral water, and some overpriced protein bars, but her presence filled the store with an unmistakable tension. At first, it started with loud sighs and dramatic eye-rolling. Davidson would purposely make a show of checking her expensive watch whenever Margaret paused to read a label or compare prices. Other shoppers began to notice, exchanging uncomfortable glances as Davidson's behavior became increasingly obvious. She wasn't just impatient, there was something more sinister brewing beneath her polished exterior. "Some people just don't know how to shop efficiently," Davidson muttered, loud enough for nearby customers to hear. She pushed her cart closer to Margaret, who was carefully selecting a loaf of whole wheat bread. The comment hung in the air, sharp and pointed, but Margaret continued her shopping, choosing to focus on her task rather than acknowledge the obvious provocation. The produce manager, who had known Margaret for years, noticed the situation developing and began restocking items nearby, keeping a watchful eye on the unfolding scene. He'd seen his share of difficult customers over the years, but something about Davidson's demeanor set off warning bells. Davidson's comments grew progressively louder and more pointed. "I can't believe they let just anyone shop here," she announced to no one in particular, while aggressively pushing her cart past an elderly couple who had stopped to examine some canned goods. The couple quickly moved aside, sharing concerned looks. A young mother shopping with her toddler deliberately steered her cart down a different aisle, wanting to shield her child from the obvious tension. The store's regular Sunday morning customers, who were used to the peaceful atmosphere, began to feel uneasy. Some pretended to be deeply interested in reading nutrition labels, while others tried to finish their shopping more quickly than usual. "I remember when this was a nice neighborhood store," Davidson continued, her voice dripping with disdain. She followed Margaret into the cereal aisle, where Margaret was reaching for her favorite breakfast blend. "Now it's just going downhill." Each word was carefully chosen to wound, to provoke, to demean. The store's security cameras captured everything. Davidson's aggressive body language, the way she intentionally positioned her cart to block Margaret's path, the uncomfortable reactions of other shoppers. A teenage employee stocking shelves nearby texted his manager about the situation, sensing that something wasn't right. Margaret, drawing upon decades of experience dealing with difficult people, maintained her composure. She'd taught elementary school for 35 years and had handled her share of challenging parents and situations. She continued her methodical shopping, though her hands trembled slightly as she reached for items on her list. Other customers began to linger nearby, some pretending to shop while actually keeping watch over the situation. A retired police officer, who regularly shopped at the store on Sunday mornings, positioned himself at the end of the aisle, seemingly interested in comparing different brands of coffee but actually monitoring the escalating tension. Davidson's behavior grew more erratic. She began taking items from her cart and dramatically putting them back on random shelves, announcing loudly, "I guess I'll shop somewhere more appropriate. This place isn't what it used to be." Yet despite her declarations, she continued to follow Margaret, aisle by aisle. The store manager, alerted by concerned employees, began making his way toward the section. He'd dealt with Davidson before. She was known for making complaints about trivial issues and demanding to speak to corporate headquarters over minor inconveniences. But today seemed different. There was a dangerous edge to her behavior that hadn't been present before. Margaret could feel her heart racing, but years of life experience had taught her to stay calm in the face of intimidation. She'd lived through the civil rights era, raised 3 children on her own after her husband's passing, and dealt with countless challenging situations in her teaching career. She wasn't about to let this woman's behavior drive her from her weekly shopping routine. Respect was a two-way street. The morning light continued to stream through the store's front windows, casting long shadows down the aisles as more shoppers began their weekly routines. The scene was set for what would become an unforgettable Sunday morning at Central Park Market, where a simple shopping trip would transform into a powerful reminder about respect, dignity, and standing up for oneself, regardless of age. On a crisp Sunday morning in September, life was about to take an unexpected turn at Central Park Market, a modest grocery store nestled in the heart of downtown. The sun had barely peeked through the clouds when Margaret Johnson, a 68-year-old retired school teacher with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes that crinkled when she smiled, made her way through the automatic doors, shopping list firmly in hand. Margaret wasn't just any shopper, she was practically a fixture at Central Park Market. For 23 years, she'd walked these aisles every Sunday morning, right when the store opened at 8 a.m. The early morning shopping had become her personal ritual, a peaceful way to start her week before heading to church. The store employees knew her well. Even the newest ones quickly learned to recognize her warm smile and the gentle way she'd ask about their families. This particular morning started like any other. Margaret had parked her well-maintained 2010 Honda Civic in her usual spot, grabbed her recycled shopping bags from the trunk, and straightened her favorite blue cardigan, the one her granddaughter had given her for Christmas. She took her time selecting a shopping cart, wiping down the handle with the sanitizing wipes provided by the store, just as she'd done hundreds of times before. Inside, the store was quiet, with only a handful of early birds doing their shopping. The produce section was Margaret's first stop as always. She loved taking her time here, carefully inspecting each fruit and vegetable. Years of experience had taught her exactly how to pick the ripest tomatoes and the freshest lettuce. The produce manager, who was arranging a display of apples, waved to her with a friendly "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson." Margaret had her shopping down to a science. She moved methodically through each aisle, consulting her neatly written list, occasionally adjusting her reading glasses as she compared prices and checked expiration dates. She was particularly excited today because the store had advertised a special on her favorite brand of tea, the one she enjoyed every afternoon while working on her crossword puzzles. As she carefully selected a bunch of bananas, weighing them in her experienced hands to ensure they'd ripen perfectly over the week, she noticed more shoppers beginning to filter in. The peaceful morning atmosphere was gradually filling with the supple sounds of shopping carts, quiet conversations, and the soft background music playing over the store's speakers. What Margaret didn't notice was the woman who had just entered the store, pushing her cart with sharp, aggressive movements. This woman, who would soon upend the peaceful Sunday morning routine, was scanning the store with irritation clearly written across her face, as if the very act of sharing the space with others was a personal affront to her. The fluorescent lights buzzed quietly overhead as Margaret consulted her list again, unaware that her peaceful Sunday routine was about to become anything but ordinary. She adjusted her purse strap on her shoulder and moved toward the dairy section, her cartwheels squeaking slightly on the freshly waxed floor. The store's security cameras silently recorded everything, their small red lights blinking steadily, silent witnesses to the events that were about to unfold. Margaret had lived through enough decades to have seen both the best and worst of humanity. She'd participated in civil rights marches in her youth, taught hundreds of children over her 35-year teaching career, and had always maintained her dignity and grace, even in the face of adversity. She'd raised 3 children on her own after losing her husband to cancer 15 years ago, and had recently started volunteering at the local library's reading program for kids. As she reached for a carton of eggs, carefully opening the container to check for cracks as she'd always done, the morning's peaceful atmosphere was about to shatter. The woman who had entered earlier was now making her way down the same aisle, her cart's wheels making an angry screech against the floor, a sound that seemed to mirror her increasingly visible agitation. Little did anyone in Central Park Market know that this ordinary Sunday morning was about to become the talk of the town, and Margaret Johnson's typical shopping trip would turn into something that would make local headlines and spark important conversations throughout the community. The security cameras continued their silent vigil, about to capture a sequence of events that would remind everyone that age was just a number. And,